Through the years that the British were in India, and through the period that Shimla was the summer capital, the so-called summer capital of the British Empire in India, only 3 carriages and later cars were permitted into this town. These belonged to the Governor General and Viceroy of India, the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, and the Lieutenant Governor of the Punjab. The town civil surgeon was allowed, in later years, when motor vehicles were available, was allowed a jeep and a motorcycle. As far as the rest of the town was concerned, they walked, they rode, or they used the human pulled and pushed rickshaw. The rickshaw is what I talk about, the rickshaw is what I talk about and write about in my latest article in the Tribune, which is focused around the infamous rickshaw coolie murder case which took place in the colonial years in Shimla. The rickshaw ended up becoming a very odious form of transport. Perhaps at a point of time when, and in a situation where human life, human comfort were given no importance or given minimal importance. At the same time, a racial divide also existed. The rickshaw pullers who were in this town lived in terrible conditions. In the 1960s, as late as the late 1960s, the rickshaws were around in Shimla. Then they were banned by a court order, mostly, I won't say mostly, but primarily on human grounds. And many of these rickshaw pullers, simply because of the conditions of their livelihoods, where they lived in those terrible abysmal conditions, and that the fact that their labor was of such intensity and placed so much pressure on their lungs, many of them had become tubercular. They, of course, had the situation that they themselves were tubercular, but there also was the additional danger that this disease could be passed on to whoever took their services or were their passengers, so to say. In this period of time, one wonders, how did this rickshaw first come about? The early roads, the early paths across the hills, this is not just about Shimla, this is practically every single hill station across our country. In those early years, people would, as I mentioned, walk or ride, because the roads, the paths, simply could not take any traffic with wheels. They were broken, they were rutted, they were narrow, they had brambles and branches all over them, their rocks would stick out. All these basic situations of a rough, rugged, almost like frontier towns or frontier villages. That's what these places really looked like. This was to change in later years, but in those early years, what were called the dandis and the dolis were basically palkis or palanquins, which would be carried, where 2 men in front with holding the pole, 2 men at the back holding the pole, and a chair or something like a sling in between would transport a passenger from point A to point B. The rickshaw was perhaps introduced in the late 19th century after a prototype which had been seen in Japan by certain people. The assumption is that it was a pastor who was working in Shimla, who had served either in China or in Japan or in both, and had seen this prototype and decided to bring it to this town, which was subsequently modified and subsequently became a little bit of a fairly established industry in this town. The Imperial Rickshaw Works remained for several years, and strangely enough, when I had a broken leg and had to be moved, the only means of transport that was available at that point of time from where we live was a rickshaw, and I perhaps may have ended up becoming one of the last people to have ever used a rickshaw as late as the 1980s. The rickshaws were banned long before that. A few of them were still available because the men were still using them. Those men who worked at one point of time as rickshaw pullers finally ended up becoming job porters or as touts for local hotels. This is what many of them ended up doing. Coming back to the point of the rickshaws, I'm not going to talk about the rickshaw coolie murder case. I'd suggest you read the article and maybe you have a little feedback about it. And as I said, I'm not going to talk about that. But in later years, this was largely thanks to nationalist pressure, partly thanks to a little more humanitarian view of looking at things, that these people were finally given what were the rickshaw sheds and labour hostels. These rickshaw sheds and labour hostels remain in Shimla. Their structures remain in Shimla to the present day. Many of them are in fairly prominent, the couple of them that are there are in fairly prominent local positions. One is very close to the Chief Minister's house, Okover. But these are now almost like they are reasonably well maintained, but the rickshaws are not there. A few labourers perhaps use these and live in them. And to the best of my knowledge, they are owned by the Shimla municipality. Cars were subsequently to overtake transport here. Gandhiji, when he came to Shimla, was totally opposed to the use of the rickshaw. He refused to ride in it. He found it an odious means of transport. The same was the case with Pandit Nehru. Pandit Nehru used a horse and rode to many of the meetings which were held at Viceregal Lodge. Gandhiji, under compulsion more than anything else, very briefly used the rickshaw which transported him up to Viceregal Lodge for a couple of meetings which were to be held with the Viceroy at that point of time. This is the point of time when India's national movement had accelerated. We were looking at things from a more humanitarian viewpoint. The one basic thing which stood out in all these years was the almost dismissive way of looking that the British looked at the Indians. There had been cases where Indians had been assaulted by soldiers. Interestingly enough, it is one of the most controversial viceroys of British India, Lord Curzon, who clamped down severely on incidents like this and on these assaults on natives, as they were called, and took severe action against those people who had perpetrated those assaults and had them booked and brought to justice. Times have changed. Shimla is better known today for its, at least on the highway, for its traffic jams than for smooth movement. It's a lighter way of putting things, but as we sometimes say that if you want to reach someplace on time, walk. You know how long it's going to take you to walk from one place to the other. If you use a car, there's every possibility that you'll get stuck in a traffic jam. And very fortunately, that odious means of transport, the rickshaw, is long gone.